Hola clase, muy buenos días, buenas tardes, buenas noches. ¿Cómo están? Yo estoy bien. Today we're going to be talking about grammar 6.2, which in your textbook is here on pages 202 hasta 203. So if you want to follow along in your textbook, please do. But as always, the PowerPoint that we're going to look at now is exactly the same as what you have in your textbook. So we're going to be talking, in lesson 5, we talked about direct object pronouns, which receive the action of the verb directly. Those were me, te, lo, la, nos, los, and las, to refresh your memory. But in contrast, we use the indirect object that receives the action of the verb indirectly. So in the example we have here, we have the subject, which is Roberto. We have the indirect object pronoun le, the verb presta, the direct object, which is 100 pesos, and the indirect object is a Luisa. And so Luisa is receiving the 100 pesos, which is the direct object of the verb, to lend. So it tells us here an indirect object is a noun or pronoun that answers the question to whom or for whom an action is done. So in this preceding example, the indirect object answers this question, ¿A quién le presta Roberto 100 pesos? So to whom does Roberto lend 100 pesos? A Luisa. And we'll see what this le and a Luisa business is in a moment. So first the forms, okay? So the forms are similar to the direct object pronouns with the exception of here for le and less. So there's a few less because in the direct we had lo, la here, and then we had los, las. So there were 4 forms, whereas here we only have 2. So the forms are me, te, le. Notice that le can be for you, formal. That's if you're talking to the usted, or for him or her. Nos, we skip over os, right? Because that's the vosotros form. And then les. So 2 are for you, 2 are for them. So it tells us down here, atención, that the forms of the indirect object pronouns are for the first, second person, me, te, nos, are the same as the direct object pronouns, which I was just saying. Where the difference is indirect object pronouns agree in number with the corresponding nouns, but not in gender. Okay, so keep that in mind. So in terms of using indirect object pronouns, we Spanish speakers commonly use both an indirect object pronoun and the noun to which it refers in the same sentence. So this is done to emphasize and clarify to whom the pronoun refers. For instance, ella le vende la ropa a Elena. So we have the le, which is like saying her. So in English, this doesn't make sense. It doesn't work because in English, I'd be like saying she sells the rope to her to Elena. So you're like doubling it. But in Spanish, it's very common with le and les, at least. So there's another example in the plural, les prestamos el dinero a Inés y a Alex. So again, that would be like saying I lend the money to them, to Alex and Inés. So in English, it sounds silly. In Spanish, it doesn't. But remember, Spanish is a different language. So you can use it without the noun when it's clear who the person is. So for instance, in the beginning of a conversation, you may say something like, Ana le presta la falda a Elena. So now we've established that we're talking about Elena. So in the same string of thought, you could say, también le presta unos jeans. So here we don't have to say again to a Elena because we know that this le is referring back to a Elena. But typically in the start of a sentence or in the beginning of a conversation, you would double them both. You would say le and then a to whomever the person is. In terms of placement, they're placed before conjugated verbs, right? And then the no just goes before the indirect object pronoun and the verb. So for instance, Martín me compra un regalo, that me has to go before the verb, and Eva no me escribe cartas, the no goes before me. Now, as we have seen before, when we have a conjugated verb and an infinitive, or we have the present participle, which is the gerund, the present tense, the ing, we have the option of either attaching the indirect object pronoun to the end or putting it before the conjugated verb. For instance, with an infinitive, remember an infinitive just means an unconjugated verb. And these 2 examples, we can say él no quiere pagarte, or we can say él no te quiere pagar. So in the first one, we attach it to the end of the infinitive. In the second example, we put it in front of the conjugated verb. And they both mean the same thing. The same thing happens with the gerund. Él está escribiéndole una postal a ella, o él le está escribiendo una postal a ella. Now, remember that if we attach anything to the end of the gerund, we have to put an accent on the E or the A that comes right before the N. It's always the case. That's always where it is. It's always in this. You always locate the N and the vowel right next to it. It's either an E or an A, and you put an accent mark over it. That's only if we attach something to it. If we put it in the front here, as you can see, escribiendo has no accent on it. And because the indirect object pronouns le and les have multiple meanings, Spanish speakers often clarify to whom the pronouns refer with the preposition a, and with the pronoun or with the noun, which we were seeing earlier, right? Which is very common. So for instance, if you were to just to say randomly, yo le compro un abrigo, that's unclarified. We don't know who that le is referring to. Who are you buying that hat for? Is it for you, usted? Is it for he? Is it for her? Is it for Jamie? Is it for Mark? We don't know. So you would typically say, yo le compro un abrigo a usted, or a él, or a ella. Same with this one, ella le describe un libro. We don't know to whom this le is referring, so it says ella. So to clarify it, we would say, ella le describe un libro a Juan. So a Juan. So here we're using the noun. Same in the plural. Él les vende unos sombreros. It's ambiguous. Ellos les hablan muy claro. Ambiguous. So to clarify, we'd say, él les vende unos sombreros a ellos, ellas, o ellos les hablan muy claramente a los clientes, for example. Now, two common verbs that are used with indirect object pronouns are dar, which because it means to give, and you give something to somebody, so that to somebody is the indirect object, and decir, because you say something to someone, okay? So notice that dar and decir both are irregular yo forms. So for dar you say doy, and for decir you say digo. And then for decir, the rest, it's a stem change, because you see that the E here from decir turns to an I. Okay, so let's do dar. So please repeat after me. Doy, das, da, damos, dan. All right, so those are the form for to give. So I give, you give, etc. Okay. Decir, repita clase. Digo, dices, dice, decimos, dicen. All right, so those are those forms. So here are a few examples here. Me dan una fiesta cada año. And you have the English there. Te digo la verdad. All right, so these are all indirect object pronouns, because what is it that they throw every year? A party. And for whom do they throw it? For me. What do you say? The truth. To whom do you tell the truth? To you. I'm telling you the truth. Te digo. Voy a darle consejos. I'm going to give her advice. This one is a bad example because it actually, we would need more. It would have to say, voy a darle consejos a ella, or voy a darle consejos a Maria, or something, right? Because it's ambiguous. No les digo mentiras a mis padres. So this is a good example because it uses the les with the a mis padres. What don't you say? Lies. To whom don't you say them? To my parents. Okay, good. So that was the end of the slide. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this, and we're going to do a few activities. So we'll start with a quién. So you know the drill, please. Again, if you want to follow along in your textbook, it'd be in page 202, 205. So you can have that open. And we'll go through each one, and I'll say pause. You'll pause the video. You'll think about the answer, and when you think you have an answer, you press play, and then I'll put the answer there. Okay, so numero uno. Well, first let's look at the instructions. It says fill in the blanks with the correct indirect object pronoun. So we're only using the me, te, le, nos, les. That's it, those 5 forms. Número uno, blank. Pido a la profesora los libros de español. Pause. And we're back. So here would be le. Because a la profesora. So it's like saying a ella. Número dos. Amelia blank pregunta a nosotros a dónde queremos ir. Pause. And we're back. It would be nos. Emilia nos pregunta a nosotras, right? A nosotras a dónde queremos ir. So that's kind of the hint, right? You see, that's going to help you out a lot. Número 3. El empleado blank busca trabajo a sus primas en el almacén. Pause. And we're back. Here would be less because we have a sus primas. So that's like saying a ellas, right? 4. Julio blank quiere dar un televisor nuevo a sus padres. Pause. And we're back. Otra vez tenemos less. ¿Por qué? Porque a sus padres. Número 5. Los clientes blank piden rebajas a nosotros todos los años. Pausa. Y aquí estamos otra vez nos, porque tenemos aquí a nosotros. Bien, número 6. Tu hermano no presta la ropa a ti. Pausa. Y aquí estamos, aquí sería te. Tu hermano no te presta la ropa a ti. Muy bien. Número 7. Que diga, sí, 7. La empleada de la tienda cerró la puerta a mi tía. Pause. And we're back. Here would be le, porque a mi tía is like saying a ella, ¿verdad? Bien, número 8. La mamá no blank hace la tarea a sus hijos. Pausa. Y bien, la mamá no les hace la tarea porque les a sus hijos. Eso es como decir a ellos. 9. Blake deben pagar mucho dinero a ti porque llevas ropa muy cara. Pausa. Y aquí hemos vuelto te, ¿no? Porque deben pagar mucho dinero a ti. Eso es. Ok, el último número 10. Las dependientas traen el vestido rosado a mí. Pausa. Y aquí estamos, me. ¿Cómo sabemos que es me? A mí. Muy bien, eso fue una. Vamos a hacer 3 actividades. Entonces, esto es la primera. Vamos a la segunda, que se llama elegir. ¿Okay? Entonces vamos a leer las instrucciones. Dicen, select the answer that logically and correctly completes each sentence. So, you know the drill. All right, so this is a drop down. So I'll leave that. I'll say pause and then wait a second. You pause it, and when you're ready, you come back and give your answer. El vendedor les dice, le pregunta o les pregunta el precio a los clientes. Pausa. And we're back. So here it would be les dice, right? Porque a los clientes, so that's les. And it's dice because he's telling the price to the client. So it wouldn't make sense that he's asking the price of the clients, right? Muy bien, número 2. Ahora mismo mi mamá está en una tienda. Blank un mensaje electrónico para saber si quiero una bolsa nueva. So, ¿qué decimos aquí? Me escribe un mensaje, le escribe un mensaje, me lee un mensaje, le lee un mensaje. Pausa. Y hemos vuelto, sería me escribe un mensaje a mí. So this one's a little trickier because you don't have the but the context will tell you that it's me because here you have quiero una bolsa. So she writes me a message to see if I want a new bag. Okay, that one you might want to spend a little bit of time with that one to understand it. But you can pause this video right now and really think about it and see if it makes sense. Okay, número 3. Aquí tenemos tus amigos, es una pregunta. Tus amigos blank muchos regalos en tu cumpleaños. Entonces, tus amigos le dan muchos regalos, tus amigos te dan muchos regalos, tus amigos le piden muchos regalos, tus amigos te piden muchos regalos. Pausa. Y volvimos, y aquí sería te dan. Y sabemos que es te dan porque es tu cumpleaños y también tus amigos. Entonces, do your friends give you a lot of gifts on your birthday? Because the other one would be, do your friends ask for a lot of gifts on your birthday? Which doesn't really make sense now. 4. La dependienta blank una falda verde a Cristina. So les compra, le vende, les vende. Pausa. Y hemos vuelto. Aquí sería le vende, porque la dependiente is the clerk, right? So it's selling, makes sense, not buying. Y a Cristina, entonces le, es como decir a ella. Bien. 5. Los muchachos blank el nuevo centro comercial a Roberto y a mí. So le describen, nos describen, le explican, nos explican. Pausa. Y volvimos. Y sería nos describen. Porque a Roberto y a mí. Entonces a nosotros. Y describir, they're describing the new mall as opposed to they're explaining the new mall. Makes more sense. Muy bien, y finalmente número 6. María siempre a usted con tarjeta de crédito. Entonces sería le paga, le presta, te presta. Pausa. Y volvimos, sería le paga, porque a usted y con tarjeta, you would pay, not lend with a card. Excelente, excelente. Entonces esta actividad ha sido muy buena. Vamos a cerrar ella y hacer una actividad más. Y esta actividad tiene que ver con dar y decir, ¿no? So again, you can go back to your textbook, pages 202 to 205 if you need some help. And the instructions tell us to use the cues to fill in the breaks with the appropriate indirect object pronoun and the correct form or of dar and decir. We have to follow the model. So the model says, mi hermana, it tells us to me, su abrigo cuando hace frío. So dar obviously makes more sense than decir. So mi hermana me da su abrigo. Vale, número 1. Los profesores blank mucha tarea. To us. Pausa. Y volvimos, sería nos, porque that's to us, and the verb would be dar, right? They give a lot of homework, so dan, porque los profesores nos dan mucha tarea. Bien. 2. Yo, to them, regalos a mis amigos. Pausa. Y volvimos, so the to them would be les, and the verb would again be dar, because you give gifts, so it would be doy. Remember, that's an irregular one. Yo les doy regalos a mis amigos. Bien. 3. Que blank to you, formal singular. So that's saying usted. So, que blank sus padres cuando duerme mucho. Okay, pausa. And we're back. So this was a little trickier. So it would be le, because that's to you, formal singular. So a usted. And when you sleep a lot, so what do your parents say to you? So le dicen, ¿qué le dicen sus padres cuando duerme mucho? Usted. That one was a little tricky, but you can think about that for a moment. Okay, número 4. Comprar ropa to me, mucha alegría. Muy bien. Pausa. And we're back. This one's a little tricky. To me, we know would be me. That's like saying a mí. But then what's the subject? Believe it or not, the subject is comprar ropa. So buying clothes. So da. So it's like saying it here. So comprar ropa me da mucha alegría. So it brings me a lot of happiness. It gives me happiness. Again, that one's a little tricky, but you can pause this video and think on it for a moment if you need to. Okay, número 5. Tus amigos, to you, familiar singular. So that's like saying a ti. So tus amigos blank la verdad. So it's a question. Pausa. And we're back. So it'd be te. Tus amigos te dicen, right? Because it's always decir la verdad. It's never dar la verdad. Decir, right? To tell the truth. Dicen. That's because it's tus amigos. Bien. Número 6. Yo, to you, familiar singular. So again, this is a ti. Que la blusa no hace juego con los pantalones. Pausa. And we're back. So here it would be yo te digo. Right, because you're making a comment. You're saying that the blouse doesn't go well with the pants. Okay, so yo te digo que la blusa no hace juego con los pantalones. So this is all vocabulary from this chapter. So if you need a refresher on that, go just look at the vocabulary list for chapter 6. So hacer juego con means to go with, to, in terms of clothing. Número 7. Juan y Carla, to us, la tarjeta de crédito para ir de compras. Pausa. Y volvimos. Juan y Carla, nos, because that's to us. And then would they tell us the credit card or give us the credit card to go shopping? They would give us the credit card. So nos dan la tarjeta de crédito para ir de compras. Y finalmente, número 8, nosotros, to him, que estudie más. Pausa. Y hemos vuelto. So here would be le, because that's to him. And what do you think? We give to him to study more, or we tell him to study more? We tell him to study more. So nosotros le decimos, right? From the verb decir, que estudie más. Okay, muy bien, clase. Long video. Buen trabajo y hasta luego. If you have any questions, write me an email. Ciao.